Okay, this is the moment many of you have been waiting for. We're going to examine some of the various rapture views. We're already starting to pick up some clues about this. This is a hotly contested issue within the church, so we want to be sensitive to it. I realize there'll be those of you that are viewing these videos that have a different view than I have, but I want to encourage you in this way. Stay with the study. And let's follow the evidence. Always be an inductive studier, an inductive student of the Bible. Be a good Berean. Go to the Scripture daily. Let's see if what I'm saying has any validity. But let's start picking up on these clues as we go along. Let's start get a piece of evidence here, a piece of evidence there, and see if we can start making some sense of this puzzle. There will be benefit to all of us for going through this study, even if we end up disagreeing on the other end. And there's plenty of room for disagreement here, but we're going to get a blessing. It was promised to us for going through the Revelation study, the only book of the Bible that gives us that special promise for being diligent and for reading and hearing the words of the prophecy. So let's take a look at some of the rapture views that are out there that are popular within the church, and so that we'll be sensitive to them when we come to them. The first that we hear a lot about is known as the pre-tribulation rapture. Well, the pre-tribulation rapture, the view is that the rapture of the church, where God raptures his people, gathers his people together, takes us up to be with him, that this is going to be at an unknown time, but it's going to occur before those final 7 years, before that 70th week of Daniel, that we unfortunately often refer to as the tribulation period. It's not technically correct, but we'll use it from time to time here in our study. And the idea of these rapture views is wrapped up around calling that final 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel, calling that the tribulation period. For some other reasons, we're going to see that's not entirely precise, can be a bit misleading, but we'll use that terminology here because it's become common in our everyday usage. So there's an unknown time, so it could happen at any time. The doctrine of imminency here is very much a part of the pre-tribulation rapture. There's nothing else that has to happen before Jesus comes back to gather his elect from the face of the earth. Now, there's also a subset to this. There's a subset to all of these rapture views, and I want you to be sensitive to this as well. We will explore all of them in greater depth when we get to chapter 14, but one of the subsets of the pre-tribulation rapture view is called a partial or an incremental rapture. And this view says that the overcomers, the ones that are referred to as overcomers, are not all believers. I took you down the study when we did our study of chapters 2 and ended up in chapter 3 with the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Every one of the letters made a reference to the overcomers. There was a clue to the overcomers in all of the 7 letters. And we came to the conclusion, I came to the conclusion, that this is generally speaking to all believers. But there are people that have an opposing view to that, and those that adhere to the partial or incremental rapture would be among those. The overcomers are a separate subset of the church, specifically that are going to be alive at the time that 7-year period kicks off, and they are the ones that are going to be raptured first. And then the remainder of the believers who are left on planet Earth are raptured incrementally as we go through that last 7-year period. So I just want you to be aware of that. That's a subset of what we refer to as the pre-tribulation rapture. Now let's look at the mid-tribulation rapture. The mid-tribulation rapture holds that the rapture of the church occurs about halfway through that, or at the halfway mark of that 70th week. So that would put it about, 3.5 years in. So at or near the time that the abomination of desolation that we studied in our past sessions, along about the time that abomination shows up in the holy place, declares himself to be God, that's the trigger for a mid-tribulation rapture. And so that puts it about 3.5 years into that 7-year period, because Daniel in chapter 9 told us what Gabriel had told him, that there would be, that the Antichrist, the prince who is to come, would confirm a treaty or confirm a covenant with the many, and that would start the clock ticking that would lead up to Jesus's coming, Jesus's return after that 70th week, after those 7 years. And in the middle of that week, in the middle of the 7-year period, is when the abomination of desolation shows up. It's what Jesus was referring to on the Olivet Discourse. And so the mid-tribulation rapture view is that somewhere around that midpoint is where and when the church is raptured. There's also a subset of this. It's known as the pre-wrath rapture. That's hard to say. Pre-wrath rapture. And this has become somewhat popular here in recent years. And the idea is that the rapture of the church occurs before the seventh seal on the scroll is broken by the Lamb. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, obviously, but this view would be that somewhere in the middle, before the seven trumpets judgments and before the seven bowl judgments, that the church is raptured at that time. So we're protected from God's wrath. There's some cross-references in one of the letters to the seven churches that talks about being protected from God's wrath. And so this particular view is that the wrath that occurs, the judgments that occur in the first six seals, including the four horsemen that we're studying about now, which are the first four of the seven seals, that's Satan's wrath coming on planet Earth, and that God's wrath comes with the breaking of the seventh seal, which leads to the seven trumpets, which leads ultimately to the seven bowls. And that's what the church is protected from. So that's the view of the pre-wrath rapture view, that the church is protected from, specifically from the trumpets and the bowls. All right, and that leads us to the post-tribulation view, which was the classical view of the church. The classical view of the church was that Jesus will return and rapture his church at the end of that 70th week Daniel. In other words, these two events occur somewhat simultaneously. They're linked together, the coming of Jesus Christ and the gathering of his elect together. We saw some clues about that in our last session. So that puts the timing of this at or near the time of that final battle. We often call it the Battle of Armageddon, not technically precise either. It's really because the battle is taking place at Jerusalem. The armies are gathering at the plains of Megiddo, which is Armageddon. But the battle is taking place at Jerusalem. But that's the last great battle, and Jesus comes back on his white horse. We read about this in Revelation 19, and he slays the wicked, he slays the kings, and he rescues the remnant, and just in time before all flesh is killed. So he comes back in time to save the remnant of the elect. And so that's the view of the post-tribulation rapture. Now there is a seventh, or there is a subset of that called the seventh trumpet rapture. And the seventh trumpet rapture holds that the rapture of the church occurs at the last trumpet, the seventh trumpet in that series of seven trumpets. That would be the last trumpet. And there's some scriptural references that we'll analyze in more detail when we get to chapter 14 that specifically speak about the last trumpet. The dead in Christ will rise first, and then those that are still alive will be caught up with him in the air. And so the idea is that the church will be pulled out, caught up with Jesus in the air as he's returning, and that they're going to be protected from that final battle, and specifically from the seven bowl judgments. The seven bowl judgments are the fulfillment of God's wrath, and we'll read about that when we get to them in our study. And so the seventh trumpet rapture holds that all this occurs very close to the end, but just before the seven bowls, because it's the last trumpet. That turns out to be the clue. And I'm just going to tell you, I'll go ahead and let it out of the bag. This is the category that I fall into, is a seventh trumpet rapture view. If this is somewhat foreign to you, or you don't know what we're talking about here, or you have a contrary rapture view, that's okay. Let's all try to set our preconceived notions aside, and let's follow the evidence and follow the scripture and see where it leads us. But I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. That's where I end up falling after many, many years of study of this topic. And we're going to go through all of these in even greater detail when we get to chapter 14. But I want you to be sensitized to them so that you can begin to pick up on these clues as they come up in our studies. And we're going to see several of them coming up. Now, these labels, mentioned that already, they're a little bit misleading. When we use the term tribulation here to describe a rapture view, we're using it to describe that final 7-year period, either pre-tribulation, the church is raptured before that 7-year period kicks off, mid-tribulation, that they're raptured right in the middle of it, somewhere 3.5 years in, and the post-tribulation rapture, it occurs somewhere near the end, at or near the time of Jesus' return. And the reason that is technically incorrect is because Jesus specifically refers to the last 3.5 years as the Great Tribulation. He uses that term, but he prefaces it with the adjective great. So the Great Tribulation is that last 3.5 years, the last half of the 70th week period. Now, we looked at 2 Thessalonians 2 in our last session, and we realized that the second coming and the rapture are linked together in time. Jesus comes back and gathers his elect. The rapture actually occurs second in that order, so they seem to be occurring at the same time, and they're linked together. So that's one of the reasons that I adhere to this post-tribulation rapture view. You're going to see this in the Olivet Discourse. We haven't finished our study of the Olivet Discourse yet. I'm just kind of priming the pump here, and we're going to see Jesus repeating this pattern in the Olivet Discourse in the accounts that we have there. So now that we've got these rapture views in mind, let's continue our study of the Olivet Discourse and pick back up with Jesus' confidential briefing to his disciples about his second coming.